Associate Professor at the School of Library and Information Science. I also am the Director of the Archives Concentration, the Postmaster Certificate in Archives, co-director of the dual degree program with the History Department, and I'm the MS Program Director. So I wear a variety of different hats at the SLIS, but most importantly in this context, I direct our Archives Concentration, which is one of our larger concentrations. What I'm going to be talking about today is three different research efforts that I've been stewarding over the last couple of years that have to do with inclusive efforts in archives. And in particular, for two of them, my area of expertise is archival description. And so for two of the research projects I'll be talking about center on archival description and providing access to archival materials. The third research effort came out of an engagement with one of those, and I'll explain that when I get there. Please don't hesitate to think up questions and ask questions. I know Dana will be monitoring the chat. So if your question comes to you, please enter it into the chat. We'll have plenty of time at the end of the session to answer questions and have hopefully a discussion. So let's get started here. The first thing I want to talk about is the trajectory of archival description and how we got to where we are now, which is really around reparative description initiatives in archives. Prior to 1988, there was not a lot of standardization in archival description, or actually it should be 1983 was the first edition, 1988, second edition, where Steve Henson published his archives, personal papers, and manuscripts, which was one of the first kind of codified guides on the content of archival description. Fast forward about 16 years, if I can do my math on the top of my head, to 2004. That's when Describing Archives, a Content Standard, was published. DAX came out of an initiative that started off as CUSTARD, which stood for the Canadian-US Task Force on Archival Description. And then eventually, because the group itself couldn't come to a consensus, became sort of USTRD, the U.S. Task Force on Archival Description, which resulted in DAX. The Canadians actually produced RAD 2, which is the Rules for Archival Description, second edition, as part of their effort at that time. DAX was really a departure from what APPM, our Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscripts, was, because it became a platform neutral expression. So it was guidelines on how to write description for not only catalog records, which is what APPM specialized in, but also for finding aids. Along those lines, DAX had a second edition published in 2019, and we'll talk about 2013, we'll talk about some of the revisions that have gone on after that, because it is currently under continuous review and update. And then we'll talk a little bit about beyond DAX, because that's really where reparative description comes in. So these are the three sort of versions of archival description standards. Preceding Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscripts, there was the Manual for the Arrangement and Description of Archives. This actually came out of the European community. It was a Dutch manual, but it was the first articulation of any kind of rules around describing archives. And a lot of the principles that we adhere to today, including provenance and respect de fond and original order, were articulated in the Manual for the Arrangement and Description of Archives, and have thus been adopted and adapted by descriptive standards going forward. There we go. I think most significantly, in terms of the predecessor to reparative description initiatives, was the revision of the DAX principles. In the original DAX articulation there in 2004, there were 8 principles. All of those principles are still embedded in the new set of DAX principles. There's now 11, but there's some other more explicit principles that really get at where we are going forward with archival description. So the notion that archival description itself expresses our professional ethics and values is a really important thing to say out loud and to say very firmly. That users, that the audience is the fundamental reason for doing archival description. It applies to all records, regardless of format or carriers. It should be clear what archivists know and how they know it. And any actions taken on the records need to be documented. That's another principle. The description should be accessible. It should be easy to use, reuse, and share. And each collection should be described so that there are no archival materials that don't have some sort of description attached to them. User-driven reasons are what should drive enhancing description that already exists. And archival description, and this is one of my favorite principles. The first one and the last one are really the ones that I pay attention to a lot. Archival description is a continuous intellectual endeavor. And what I like so much about this last principle is the notion that we have been doing archival description for a very, very long time, and we've been doing it, as always, in our sociocultural context. And so this continuous intellectual endeavor allows us to re-examine existing description in our current sociocultural context and to make amendments to that description in order to better reflect our current ethics and values. And so the principles of DAX allow us to explicitly drive us to that kind of work. So along those lines, there have been several initiatives that have sprung up in various repositories and institutions across the United States and Canada called reparative description initiatives. I just put up two examples here, one from the University of North Carolina and one from Yale University. And I'll talk a little bit more about these two in particular. Because they're examples of these reparative description initiatives, but they're certainly not the only ones. There's actually quite a number of them. And so as I was getting ready to and thinking about reparative description and reading about it, I encountered a lot of a kind of gulf or gap in understanding of not why we need to do reparative description, why we have created harmful description and perpetuating white supremacy and perpetuating systemic racism and systemic other marginalizations in our description. Not the argument for it, but how this actually gets done and what this work looks like. And so I embarked on a writing project and engaged several project initiatives, personnel involved in projects to write a case study book. And included in that are the themes of descriptive practices reflecting sociocultural environments in which they are practiced. And that means that archivists, archives are not neutral, and we all accept that. And archivists are human and therefore not neutral. That language really matters. The kinds of words that we use and the way that we use them really matters, and it makes a difference, not only in our narrative description, but definitely there, but also in the control vocabularies that we use in order to reflect the contents of collections. Those control vocabularies are flawed. And I would say that all control vocabularies are flawed in one way or another because they express a certain perspective or a certain point of view. And there are some great initiatives and ways to mitigate against that that we can discuss. So the case studies have been compiled into a single volume called Expanding the Record, Case Studies in Reparative Description. I co-edited this volume with a former graduate research assistant. She's now a professional out in the field, but she worked with me on this. And this volume is forthcoming from the Society of American Archivists. As you can see, there is a prologue to the volume that is written by a scholar, and it's written in a historian wrestling with archival resources and access to archival evidence. The first chapter is the literature review, basically making the argument for why reparative description is so necessary. And then there are 10 chapters, each one covering an individual case of reparative description. And the pitch that I made to the authors was the sort of before and after, and what was your process like? The intention of the volume is to provide other repositories who haven't already embarked on this work with some models, some strategies, some advice about how to do this work, and also to see what it looks like. And I would say there was really, really joyful work working with the authors of these various chapters. These people are deeply committed to the work that they're doing. This is intensive personal work. It's very, it's not easy to do. And so a lot of times you really have to kind of search your own ethics and values and that sort of thing, and do research to find out what is the right kind of terminology and way to be as respectful and inclusive as possible in your description. That being said, I learned a ton from editing this volume in terms of not just what reparative description is, but where there are problem spaces. For instance, there are 2 chapters in here, one written from New York University and one written at Yale University, that both deal with Japanese incarceration during World War II. I know that in the past we have used euphemisms like internment, but that is not accurate. The Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. And both of these institutions took on Japanese incarceration projects, and both of them engaged with community members, and both of them worked in the context of their institution. And while it seems like, wow, there's 2 chapters on the same topic, but it's actually not 2 chapters on the same topic because their contexts are different. The partnerships that they worked with were different. And so there's some similarities, but there's also some really interesting differences that I think that repositories can learn from in terms of understanding your own context. In addition to the volume, I've also participated in 3 reparative description webinars. These are advanced topic webinars. The first one was comparative approaches to reparative description that covered the Japanese incarceration chapters. We had the authors from both chapters come and speak and share and compare and contrast with each other. The second one was involved the author for the University of Texas at Arlington, their initiative and some of the challenges that they faced. And then the third webinar was on assessing your reparative description initiatives. This involved engaging Sharon Mazzotta, who is one of the co-authors of the maturity model for reparative description. And she presented that model and sort of, it's a toolkit for repositories to provide to assess their own work in terms of reparative description initiatives and to see kind of where their initiative is at in terms of its maturity, and then engage with me in a conversation about that sort of challenging work of doing self-assessment on initiatives. I was really proud to be a part of these webinar series. They were really, I think, quite successful and interesting. And we'll bring back the maturity model in just a minute. So that involved the reparative description initiatives kind of broadly. But in the process of doing this, I also started another research project called harmful content statement, examining harmful content statements. Harmful content statements are sort of low-hanging fruit from a reparative description initiative perspective. They're relatively straightforward in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And I asked my then graduate student assistant to gather together a bunch of harmful content statements because I was curious sort of what constituted a harmful content statement and sort of what was going on here. He overachieved, as he always does, because he's a wonderful research partner now. And so he actually gathered 104 statements. We ended up eliminating 6 of them. So our sample size was 98. And we conducted some collaborative research. This happened after he had graduated, and he continues to work with me in research today. We did a content analysis of the collected statements, but we did it using grounded theory research, meaning that we didn't go in with preconceived notions of what we were going to find. Our actual strategy evolved over time as we were reading through the content statements, and we actually read through them several times. And you can see through our coding model, oops, there we go. We used a pretty wacky strategy for this. We did this together. Every single research initiative or research moment was spent with us talking to each other over Zoom and looking at a shared document. And we would highlight, depending on what kind of content we thought were there, in various colors, and we would come to an agreement on that together. So there weren't issues of indexing inconsistencies or anything like that, because at the end of this compilation of statements analysis, every single bit of the analysis had been agreed upon between the researchers. Let's say the other thing that came out of this, and in thinking back and reflecting on this research, the time that we spent in conversation was really where the ideas came through, right? We were reading these statements together and we were talking about what that really means and what are those words that they're using in real time. So it was a really rich research experience in the moment, and then of course presenting on it, which we did at the New England Archivists meeting, and then writing an article on it was further enriching for us. Just a little bit about what we actually discovered. Excuse me just a sec. We came up with really 10 categories of information. We had more at the beginning and, in our analysis phase. And then we started to eliminate those that weren't very meaningful. So the first category was the vocabulary of harm. Those are words that are used to notify users of the presence of harmful content. And this is content, just to be clear about this, because we'll make a distinction in my future research. This is content in the archival records themselves, not the description. Vulnerable communities, so any communities that were identified in the statement as at risk by harm in the collections. Any actions that are taken by the institution, including verbalized lack of action, such as we don't change the historical record. And then principles expressed. So any principles or ideas that serve as a foundation for a system of belief or behavior that an institution strives to embody. We also looked at institutional disclaimers, statements that distance the institution values and from the content of the records. We looked for mechanisms to provide user feedback. Many of the repositories harmful content statements had some sort of mechanism for users to provide information. Also, a lot of statements, about 50% or just a little bit over, included citations to additional resources about harmful content, both external resources, articles and vocabularies and that sort of thing, and internal resources such as collecting policies. Dates of adoption and revision was also something that we noted. Unfortunately, it was very infrequent, and we'll talk a little bit about that and why that's such a problem. A self-recognition that the institution itself has a role in perpetuating harm, and the recognition that this kind of work, reparative description, is iterative and it's ongoing, which is a really important aspect to recognize. So the frequency of these various different types of things, as you can see, everybody used some sort of vocabulary of harm, except for one statement we found that didn't have a vocabulary of harm. A lot of communities were identified. A lot of institutions identified principles that were important to them. A lot of the statements included things like the actions that they were taking. A lot of them included self-recognition and disclaimers. About half of them recognized it as ongoing work. Over half provided resources, and just over 3/4 provided user feedback. Dates was the most disappointing. There were very few statements that included dates, and I'll share why I think that's a problem, or why we think that's a problem. So our important findings, we did develop a scale for the vocabulary of harm that kind of goes from a weak statement, may or might, to a bold statement. It does harm people. We were able to identify vulnerable groups of most concern, so we actually were able to analyze that. We identified the offenses in statements. We identified 5 main principles expressed, including DEI, but also maintaining the historical record. There were 142 unique resources that were connected in 54% of the statements. So 142 unique resources. So obviously there's a momentum gaining here in the world of reparative description, and what archivists are doing about it. There were a whole bunch of a series of actions described along with reasoning. And of course, most startling was the lack of date information. We concluded our presentation and also the article that we wrote for the Journal of Digital Media Management on recommendations. And these are recommendations for developing harmful content statements. So our first recommendation is that you should always include a creation date and or revision date on a statement so that the person who is reading that statement understands the currency of its words, understands the currency of its intent. You should distinguish between harmful content in your collection versus harmful description. And just as a preview, that's where we're going next. We're looking at the distinction between content and description. You should feature user feedback and input mechanisms. That's a very important aspect to help you engage with multiple communities that you're aware of, but also communities that you might not be aware of. And you should include an institutional value statement that clearly states the institution's values. To make harmful content statements stronger, we recommend that you use bold language and preferred over diluted language. So there is harmful content in our collections rather than there may be harmful content in our collections. Definitely look at other harmful content statements as you're crafting your own. You want to, you can borrow from other people's ideas. A lot of repositories are obviously looking for others, and in those 142 unique resources, many of them are other people's harmful content statements. Use this opportunity, use this as an opportunity to educate people on why we do not censor the historical record. That's a really important aspect to archival work. And harmful content statement gives us that opportunity to acknowledge that there has been harm in the past, and it is in record in our collections, but also that we need to be aware of that harm so that we don't repeat it. And in particular, a self-recognition of an institutional role in perpetuating harm really strengthens the statement. So the current research that my research partner and I are working on is wrestling with harmful content statements versus harmful description statements, and really what is the importance of harmful content versus or harmful content statements versus identifying and recognizing harmful description. How do these statements actually differ from each other, because they're actually talking about very different things, and how we can recommend much more clarity in the different kinds of statements rather than because oftentimes they can appear very muddled. We have a much larger sample set to choose from. And I should say, just as a little asterisk, we were in no way trying to be comprehensive in our research. We went out and searched and found statements, but we in no time do we claim that we have done a comprehensive search of all harmful content statements or all harmful description statements. It's really just to get a feel for what's going on in the field. So that is the current research that I am doing with that research partner. The last research initiative I'd like to talk about is one that came out of an SAA panel on the maturity model that Stephanie Luke and Sharon Mazzotta put together. They presented this at the 2023 SAA conference. And it was an excellent presentation. I think the maturity model is an excellent piece of scholarship. And I was really fascinated by their presentation. And in the aftermath, in the Q&A session, a lot of people sort of started to internalize kind of reparative description. And a couple of people would raise their hands and say, well, I work in Florida, and people would kind of laugh nervously, or I work in Texas, and people would laugh nervously. And I was sort of like thinking to myself, okay, so this isn't funny, right? This isn't funny that people are expressing or saying in a session, I'm working in a hostile political environment where this sort of work would not be welcomed. And that gave me it started me thinking about it. And so I wanted to investigate sort of recent legislation efforts and its impact on archival work. So I had a new graduate research assistant, and I proposed that we take this project on in the fall of 2023. We developed a perception survey, and that perception survey was distributed in spring of 2024. And it really asks for archivist perceptions of the current political climate and its impact on archival work. Again, it's collaborative research. We presented our findings at the SAA Research Forum in 2024, in the summer of 2024. And I'll talk about some follow-up research that we're doing. Oops. Okay. The survey was distributed in spring of 2024 through the archives and archivist list, email list, which is through SAA. There were 15 questions, 4 were demographic, 9 legislation questions, and 2 acts of archival resistance questions. And we got 49 respondents. We also situated our respondents according to sort of the political map of the United States. So all of the responses were from American archivists. And we color-coded our map according to the 2020 and 2022 elections to identify both red states, blue states, and purple states. And we didn't, we used the election results to provide this coding. And in the previous slide, you can see those were the states where archivists resided or worked that responded to the survey. Those aren't all the states that are red and blue and purple. One of the questions that we asked was to describe their feelings about the United States political climate on archival work. 87.8% responded that it was negative, that they were concerned, basically, about the current United States political climate and its impact on archival work. We asked a series of a question that was check all that apply, and I've broken down the little packets of this into a couple of different boxes just to give you a sampling. So we asked about the feelings about recent legislative activities, the impact of it, and they could check all 3, and actually some did, but 1 or 2 people did, but mostly it was, I feel recent legislation will have a positive impact, I feel recent legislation will have no impact, or I feel recent legislation will negatively impact archival work. And you can see that the 3rd category was by far the most popular. Whoops. We also asked what area of archival work we think that recent legislation might impact: public collecting initiatives, public services, or technical services. And while they're all relatively even, I will say that oftentimes most people picked all 3, but when they didn't pick all 3, it was collecting initiatives and public services that were more often picked than technical services, which I think is very interesting because I believe that something like reparative description, well, I have some battles with myself about reparative description being subversive work that we can do to work against anti-DEI initiatives and the like. But a hallmark of reparative description is being really open and loud about it as well. So it's sort of counterproductive if you're just trying to do it under the radar. Finally, I was interested in red, blue, purple. Does it matter? And so I mapped all the 7 options in question 7 across the red, blue, purple, and no state. There were 2 respondents who didn't identify a state, to see if there were widely different trajectories. And in actuality, there aren't. So I red, blue, purple from an archivist perception. it doesn't seem to matter. I thought it would be much broader or wider than that. And it's got a kind of sweeping sort of, they're moving, they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty darn similar. Or more similar than I would have thought. I hypothesized. Oops, 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 oops. All right, how do I go back? Previous, there we go. The last two questions that we asked, so we asked one question that was a Likert scale thing and one that was open-ended, was I believe archivists should actively combat attacks on intellectual freedom. And we asked you, the respondents, to agree, strongly agree, moderately agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And you can see that 50% of our respondents strongly agreed with this, but the other half was not universal. I mean, there's at least 30% or 27% that are kind of in the moderately agree to strongly disagree categories. And what came out of this research was a recognition, an acknowledgement that archivists are a pretty complex group of people, and that they think deeply about their values, about their professional responsibilities. They're not just sort of all in heap it on kind of group. They think very deeply about them. And there's some examples of some of the more strident statements that were provided. Oops, next. Okay. So the current research that we are doing, and my current graduate student assistant and I are doing, are stacks and statutes. So we're actually running another survey to ask graduate students about their perceptions of what's going on kind of legislatively in the country. That survey is underway as we speak, and will be closed in December. Really exciting possibilities there. With the first group we asked were professionals out in the field, and we did kind of get demographics of how long they've been professionals. And this is a group of people who are seeking to enter the profession, and are they concerned about kind of what that they might be going into, is sort of the research question that we have. So that is my slide. Oops, that is my slideshow. I'm happy to answer any questions either that came up in the chat, or if somebody has a question now, I'm more than happy to answer that live as well.
Thank you. We do have one question in the chat so far, but feel free to keep them coming. The question is, can AI or blockchain be used/helpful for this type of parsing through this material to search for harm words, phrases, statements, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the possibilities with artificial intelligence are sort of uncharted at this point. I'm a little wary about and mostly maybe it's my own ignorance in how you train an AI bot, about feeding in a bunch of basically really not nice not nice content into an AI machine, not defining what you say is not nice, what is harmful. So you'd have to define that. And as you see in the case study books, a lot of that's really a challenging issue, right? It's you need to collaborate with communities that are being represented to understand not what do you think is harmful, but what do they think is harmful. So I think the training of the AI bot would be a pretty big hurdle. In terms of, it's not just about feeding it content and expecting it to be altruistic and pure and good. AI is created by humans too. So there's some interesting possibilities there, and I think a very fertile ground for research.
Thanks. Any other questions? We do have about 10 minutes left.
Yes, we do.
Oh, yeah. All right. The research related to archivists' perception of how our current political climate affects the field is so interesting. What kind of solutions have been explored in response to these survey responses?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure that solutions right now are what people are worrying about. In the anecdotal conversations that I've been having with archivists, particularly the archivist that I collaborated on this reparative description case study book, we had an instance where some of them had to make sure that the article that they were submitting was vetted by their own institution in terms of whether or not they could actually include it. We did ask people to provide names of people who engaged in the reparative description initiatives, and we had one institution come back and say, I'm not going to give you names because I don't want them to lose their jobs. That person was willing to put themselves on the line, but not their colleagues. And so I think that right now, I'm not sure that there are a lot of solutions. As I said, I wrestle with the notion that reparative description in particular is work that can sort of fly under the radar if we don't bring attention to it, but we continue to do it. That is something that might be considered a solution if you're working in an institution that has some sort of anti-DEI, particularly. That's one of the biggest themes, anti-DEI pressures on them. I don't think the institutions are anti-DEI, it's the legislation coming out of the state houses. And so that's one thing, but again, it's counterproductive to reparative description in general, because one of the aspects of it that I think is really important is bringing attention to the work and saying, this is not sufficient any longer. We need to do better. And so it's sort of it's a problem space. I was surprised that we got answers from the wide spectrum. So we did get somebody who responded that they really felt that DEI was a political agenda, and that they thought the models of what was going on in Florida was exactly what should happen, and they were promoting that in their state. I was like, I'm really glad that you expressed that in this survey to represent that position. I mean, we need to know that's what people are, that's how they're thinking about it.
Thank you. Next question. I'm curious about your thoughts regarding harmful content statement versus trying to actually do reparative description. Do you think one strategy versus the other has more weight when trying to confront or protect against initiatives that impact marginalized communities?
Right. I think you need to do both. I think the harmful content statement, it comes out of, and there's actually a really excellent article written about the kind of the history of harmful content statements. It comes out of that, kind of movie theater rating system, right? Where if a movie's PG, it's good to let folks know that this is PG versus rated R. If it's rated R, you kind of know what your expectations are. And I think the content statements sort of prepare people to encounter materials that they might not necessarily want to encounter, but to understand that that's a historical record. I think harmful content statement and the development of one is part of reparative work, but it's certainly not the only part of reparative work. We do have to look very critically at our own production, our own work, archival description, and say, am I adequately and appropriately representing the contents of the materials, the people who are reflected in those contents in the materials? Or am I just perpetuating the harm that is in those materials by not adequately describing it or appropriately describing it?
The next question is, given the findings from your research so far, what questions would you hope to explore moving forward?
So I am very interested in the distinction between harmful content and harmful description, and the ways that archivists are engaging with that distinction through these statements. I think that that's a really important aspect to it. I'm also really interested in, and this isn't the kind of research that I normally do, but I am interested in talking to people who are engaging in harmful description or reparative description projects to find out sort of why it's meaningful to them, what it is that's driving them to promote these projects in their repositories in either, comfortable environments or hostile environments, and that sort of thing. And I say that's not the kind of research that I do, because I don't normally research directly, through interviews and that sort of thing. And so maybe I just engage in conferences and that and the like. I do hope that we continue to have really open conversations at conferences like SAA, but also in the local community archives, our archival conferences, local organizations like New England Archivists around this kind of work, and what different people are trying out, and sort of coming to an idea of the basics of reparative description, the basics of it, and how we can help people can do it going forward. One of the critiques of the compilation of the expanding the record is that most of the repositories, actually almost all of the repositories, are well-resourced repositories. And obviously that's not the only place that reparative work is happening or needs to happen. However, I was looking for projects that were underway. I wasn't looking for aspirational projects. I was looking for projects that had already conducted and begun this work. And a lot of well-resourced repositories were able to do that because of the very fact that they are well-resourced. The pandemic, it's hard to say something positive about a pandemic, but the pandemic also helped because reparative description work is something that could be done remotely. And so there was a time of kind of pause in other kinds of archival work, like processing with materials, that they were able to fill in kind of using reparative description initiatives to keep people employed and keep them also producing.
Thanks. When institutions decide to do a reparative description initiative, how do they generally decide what subjects to tackle? Are people looking for the things that fall between the big topics like Japanese incarceration? You mentioned that it should be based on that institution's context and user feedback, but I'm curious about what that looks like in practice when looking through big collections.
Right. I think that for the most part, and I mentioned UNC, so we talked about Yale did the Japanese incarceration project. UNC also had a very strong, they call it conscious editing initiative, and it's centered around Southern history because that's what UNC collects, right, and has collected for the last 100 years or 80 years. And so they really focused in on the way that they were treating enslaved people and enslavers, and the way that they were describing enslaved people and enslavers, and really bringing to light the voices of the enslaved people in a way that the collections they've had for many, many, many years, but those voices weren't being brought to the surface as boldly as they could be. So I think that it really comes from the collections themselves. So institutions sort of know where their areas of collections are. And so the decision around what to focus on really comes from that initiative or that space. It's really difficult to tackle it as a big, huge thing. It's much easier to do pieces of it. And those pieces are defined by their collections.
Thanks. We have two more questions. We're just about out of time, so we're going to do, I guess, lightning round on these two. Given the comparison to a movie rating system, is it possible that archival work to acknowledge harmful content that might have an unintended consequence of easily or directly limiting access to those materials?
Yeah, I think the acknowledgement for the systems that I've seen, the acknowledgement does not say you can't look at this because there's harmful content. It says there is harmful content here, so you may not want to look at this. So there is no really impulse to restrict access. So and the movie comparison thing was sort of the historical trajectory of kind of trigger warnings and things like that that was written about in an article. So I see it as kind of coming out of that impulse, but not being directly parallel.
Thanks. And the last question is, what crossover do you see for this work in non-archival settings like libraries, tech company, taxonomies, etc.?
Well, I think there's tons of crossover. I mean, obviously we don't hold the monopoly on records or even access to information. But I see there's tons of crossover to other realms, digital libraries in particular, particularly when you're collecting resources on subjects that are even secondary resources on subjects that are difficult. Our history is ripe with opportunities for human beings to be horrible to each other. And so I think that we should always be thinking about acknowledging and recognizing that this might be difficult for some people to engage with.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for your really thoughtful questions and your engagement today. Thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. I'm going to put one link in the chat, and that is for the next information session. So if you are thinking about attending Simmons, including our archives management concentration, we'd love to see you next week on the 19th. And if you have any questions about admission at Simmons, I'm also going to put the admission office email address in the chat. We're very happy to talk with you, have you come to visit campus, do a phone or a Zoom call to learn more about the programs. All right. Thanks
Thank you,
so much.
everyone. Great questions.